He promised himself this would be the last blind date. At 42, he had built an empire from grit and sharp deals. Boardrooms had become his cathedral, numbers his prayer. After years of matchmaking attempts arranged by friends who thought he needed someone, he agreed only once more. If it was a disaster, that would be it. The restaurant was small and warm. He arrived early, a suit like armor, a lifetime of cultivated politeness at the ready. She arrived late, flustered, with a toddler who clung to her hand. She apologized until it sounded like penance. He dismissed it with a smile. He'd learned how to be generous with an apology. She had learned to be careful with favors. She ordered something simple. When the toddler wanted sugar, she laughed and gave it. As the night unfolded, she talked about days that began before dawn and ended with folding laundry at midnight. She worked part-time and taught when she could, she said, not as a complaint, but as fact. He listened, surprised at how much his questions felt like small kindnesses. The conversation drifted from mundane to honest. She loved secondhand bookstores, sang under her breath to remember recipes, and read aloud every night as a ritual not to be skipped. Walking out into a humid street, he offered to help with childcare arrangements. She declined his money with quiet pride. He was unused to that refusal. It hooked him. He arrived for their next date at a park cafe to find a small kingdom of board books and a wooden train. He helped with groceries, fixed a crib leg, learned the child's favorite dinosaur. He offered practical help, not spectacle, driving when her car failed, bringing soup when nights were long, standing in for a missing babysitter. She accepted the things that made life easier and refused sacrificial pity. At his company, he began to notice how benefits and schedules were written like rules for people without children. He pushed silently at first, flexible hours for parents, an emergency fund for caregivers. Meetings that had once been about margins now included a mention of dignity. Colleagues raised eyebrows when he spoke of stories. He spoke anyway. Their life together grew in halting, ordinary ways. Pancakes on Saturday, bedtime rituals, broken toys repaired with clumsy staples and patience. He learned to cede control. She learned to trust the presence he offered, not the spectacle. They argued about money and privacy, about a future that wanted to be both steady and free. They negotiated floor by floor, drawer by drawer. He had not been born into wealth. He remembered a childhood of small apartments, of counting pennies to buy a paperback book, of a teacher who stayed late to help him with letters that did not come easily. That teacher had given him more than lessons. She had given him proof that help could be kind and quietly heroic. Years later, when he had a boardroom filled with executives, that memory was a ghost he mostly ignored, until the ghost found a voice in the woman with the toddler. She had a past stitched from practical choices, a brief marriage that had dissolved before the child learned to ride a bike, a family that lived in another state and sent postcards instead of help, an old college scholarship that had never quite covered everything. There were nights she slept on a friend's couch and mornings she woke with a to-do list heavy enough to startle anyone. Yet her laugh was easy, and she had a way of making cereal feel like an event for a 5-year-old. On slow afternoons, when the toddler napped, she would fold into the small rituals that kept them afloat. They read aloud until the child's dreams turned pages for him. She taught him letters with hopscotch chalk and patience. He watched how her patience did not mean she was without ambition. She volunteered at the community center, advocated for a tiny library in a strip mall, and tutored children for free on Saturdays. He realized that her work in the community had a dignity the fancy words on his corporate reports had never captured. He tried to shed his old habits. There were nights he sat in meetings wanting to stand up and shout about the absurdity of a policy that punished parents for missing a single day. He started to collect stories instead of statistics. He would call her sometimes and ask about a problem at school, or how the child's teacher handled a temper tantrum, or whether the community center needed a bookshelf. She answered without exaggeration, handing him small tasks as if they were tools rather than trophies. When the scandal broke, it was not because of malice, but because of careless accounting in a subsidiary that had grown too fast. The press loved a fall. They fed on it. He learned the anatomy of public scrutiny, how a rumor could harden into a headline, and how a year's worth of work could be reduced to a single damning paragraph. He learned how absent colleagues could be when their stock options were at stake. And he learned the opposite as well. People who reached across the noise to offer human comfort. In the trenches of that crisis, He witnessed people he had long overlooked. A middle manager arrived one morning with coffee and a note that said, "We've got you." She'd been there for him when there were no cameras. A janitor who took pride in a building said that he would keep things running no matter what. She patched him in an hour when his calendar showed nothing. She sat with him through long nights and offered practical comforts: a warm blanket, a roast chicken from her oven, a funny story about a preschool play that went terribly and ended with a standing ovation for a tiny dinosaur. After the crisis cooled, he changed company structures with intention. He established a caregiver fund that allowed employees to apply for emergency grants without jumping through bureaucratic hoops. He mandated caregiver leave that was paid and unpunished. No forms needing justification, no managers shrugging it off as indulgence. He created partnerships with local community centers for subsidized childcare slots. He added mentorship programs that paired employees who needed schedule flexibility with managers who had learned to accommodate it. The changes were practical, quietly revolutionary for families who were tired of choosing between work and their children's needs. At home, the evolution was quieter. They argued about whether to enroll the child in a private tutoring program, about how much to tell friends and colleagues about their life, about who would take the child to the dentist. They navigated jealousy when his name made the news and hers never did. They had fights that felt enormous at the time, nights where both held their phones too tightly, wondering which headline would break them. But then there were reconciliations, repairing a favorite toy together, sitting on the floor, and relearning the rules of patience. Once, he surprised her by showing up at the community center not with a check, but with paintbrushes and a willingness to help. She watched him, sleeves rolled, painting shelves and taping up flyers. For the first time, he felt what labor could teach him: the humility of doing a small, messy thing for the benefit of others. When they finished, she hugged him as if to say, "You get it, now." His eyes stung, not from effort, but from a kind of gratitude that had the same warmth as sunlight on a winter morning. The foundation took its first applicants humbly. A single mother who lost her job to a plant closure received a grant to cover rent while she retrained. A teacher who had to care for a sick parent found a temporary caregiver through the foundation's network. The organization refused to take photos for press releases. It simply tracked outcomes. Years later, the microgrants were credited with helping dozens of families regain stability. The company reported lower turnover in departments where caregiver support became a real option, not a talking point. The hardest part was reconciling public image with private truth. People loved a transformation story shaped into a tidy bow. He resisted that simplicity. He told friends and reporters that he had learned from a woman who did not ask to be saved, but who transformed him by sharing a life that was not measured by wealth. She taught him how to listen to a child's small complaints with the attention he'd once reserved for quarterly forecasts. He learned that power could be exercised with restraint. Their love was not cinematic. There were no sweeping orchestral crescendos. It lived in tiny acts: a thermos of soup left on a doorstep, a school play attended even if it meant missing a board meeting, a hand held during a hospital waiting room's long twilight. It also contained practical compromises: schedules that honored nap times and investor calls, a division of labor that never made kindness feel like a transaction. And there were, of course, moments of raw vulnerability. He found an old photo of the teacher who had once helped him and called her, unannounced, to thank her for staying in all those years ago. She said simply that she was proud that someone from her class had made the world a little kinder. He realized then that his life had come full circle. A teacher's small acts had shaped a child who would grow into a man who then learned to be generous not as showmanship, but as habit. The child's drawings accumulated: houses with crooked chimneys, stick figures under suns with too many rays, a scribbled dog with an extra tail. They became bookmarks. Each time he looked at them, he felt less of the old hunger for validation and more of an appetite for ordinary days. He kept the napkin with the first family drawing in his wallet for years, a private talisman against the arrogance of success. On quiet Sunday mornings, when the house smelled like cinnamon and the city seemed to slow its breath, he would watch her make tea and the child build forts out of pillows. A small life, ordinary and stubborn, had unmade parts of him that needed unmaking. In return, he offered stability, the kind that comes from being predictable at 2 a.m. with medicine bottles and from turning up when things were messy. When friends from his former life asked him how he changed, he would not give them a speech. He would tell them, if they asked, that the change came from seeing life through a lens other than profit, through dinners that ended with bedtime stories instead of board minutes, through policy memos that saved someone a crisis, through a foundation that funded a roof over someone's head for a month while they found their footing. It was not dramatic. It was ordinary, and thus revolutionary in its sustained humility. The woman who had once walked into a restaurant apologizing for a child had never wanted pity. She wanted partnership, dignity, and a future where the child's dreams were not limited by the size of their bank account. Instead of changing her for a life of comfort, he found his life reoriented around what she had always been building: a steady, resilient household, a community that supported one another, and a man who learned to measure worth by time and tenderness rather than by trophies. In the end, the last blind date had not been an ending at all. It was the beginning of a life where wealth was a tool and not a definition, where rescue was replaced by respect, and where a single mom's ordinary courage taught a man how to be better. The child with the crooked chimney drawing slept soundly under a blanket in a smaller home that somehow contained far more love than his old penthouse ever had. He closed the door at night and listened to the quiet, the sound of a family, and knew that everything were, of course, moments of raw vulnerability. He slept more easily than before.